Hi there. So there will be a little bit of overlap between this and the last talk, because I'm also going to be talking a bit about the limits of ethics review boards, particularly in the United States, when it comes to a narrow definition of what is under their purview. So as someone who studies and researches on tech ethics, I sometimes joke that I just make slides like this over and over again until I retire. And we see in often public controversies a number of things that relate to research ethics, particularly in computer science. I've also been involved in research ethics discussions in the HCI community for many, many years, been running workshops on research ethics, et cetera. And this question comes up a lot, like, okay, so what is ethics anyway when it comes to research? And it's really hard to answer this question, but I can give you a wrong answer that I think is more prevalent than people care to acknowledge, which is that, oh, well, it's ethical if my ethics review board tells me that it's okay for me to do it. And I think this is in part an education problem. Like, often when research ethics comes up, it's like, well, here's how you do your ethics review. And so the problem then is when there's research that doesn't fall under the purview of some ethics review body for whatever reason, we often assume that there's nothing that can be a problem about it. So my area of expertise is on ethics compliance in the United States, where the definition of human subject research is this extremely specific thing. It means interacting with people, intervening with people, or collecting identifiable private information. And identifiable is also pretty specific in this context. So what has been established does not fall under this definition for the most part, is collection of public data, for example, from the internet. So this is the first type of falling through the cracks that I'm going to talk about here, because of course we see examples of this all the time. Like, we have this, there's all of this great data out there that we can actually study a lot of really, often very important things with. There's some really interesting and valuable research that happens using public data, particularly social media, for example. And this has been the case for many years. In 2014, Zeynep Tufekci wrote this great article starting to talk about this issue of like social media, big data, and compared Twitter specifically to fruit flies when it comes to research. That Twitter has like the model organism problem, which is that people don't use Twitter data because it's like the best data. It's not that like Twitter is most representative of things that are happening in the world. It's that it's easy to get. It's easy to study in the same way that fruit flies are easy to study. And so one of the first things that I did in this space, myself and my collaborator, Nick Preferis, we did a study about how Twitter users feel about the use of their tweets in research. So I'm not going to explain this in great detail. Sadly, I do not have time. But I'll give you a little bit of a highlight from this, which is that, first of all, and I can also tell you that this is true anecdotally, most people do not know that this is a thing that happens. And, I've been doing research in this area for years, and, I'll start talking about this to someone and they're like, wait, why would scientists be reading my tweets? Like, I talk to a lot of researchers who say, well, of course people know that like researchers might be using their public data. No, they don't. They don't. There's no reason why people would necessarily know that this is a thing. There might be somewhat more awareness to this sort of thing now than there was, say, 5 years ago, because we keep seeing some, controversies around it. But still, every time there's something new like this and I'm talking about it on Twitter, I get surprised people. And I also get, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this was approved by an ethics review board. Also, a lot, most people in the study thought that, oh, well, this can't be allowed, and also that it shouldn't be allowed. There was a lot more in this study in terms of the kinds of things that influence people's feelings about this, like what would make people more comfortable if their data was being used in this way, because this is what's important, right? It is not my intention to tell people that they shouldn't use Twitter data. I've done studies that use public data. It has to do with the kinds of things that might change your approach, because the problem is that like publicness is not the like one piece of context that matters when it comes to ethics. If anything, this is what matters, at least in the United States, potentially when it comes to compliance. If the issue is will an IRB let you do it? But I would say that that is not particularly relevant to ethics. And this kind of publicness is a really, really common way that people think about this. So one example that always comes to mind for me is the OkCupid data set that was released in 2016, in part because the researcher was very adamant publicly about that this was definitely okay because the data was public. And this phrase, like in particular, like this way of putting it, well, the data is already public, is so common, so pervasive for like research ethics justifications that my collaborator, Michael Zimmer, has been writing about this exact same thing since 2010 and has like a Google search alert for the phrase, the data is already public. These kinds of issues too, like this kind of research can cause actual harm. Another example that often comes to mind for me was the data set collected from YouTube of people going through gender transition in order to train facial recognition. And this data was collected without consent. People were not informed. People's faces were in scientific articles, arguably to like help create a technology that could potentially harm their community. And in my research lab, we've been doing a number of studies about how people from different marginalized groups feel about researchers using their data. And another thing that comes up is this idea of like researchers just like coming into communities that they're not part of and might not even understand and just like taking data from them and not giving anything back. Like they don't even often know about the research. So this idea of like researchers parachuting in, like taking data, writing papers about it, and never giving anything back to the community. And my PhD student, Shamika, talked to people on Black Twitter specifically about this issue. And this was definitely a big deal, like this idea of people coming in and just like taking data from the community. But also there's this idea of like, what kinds of consequences might there be of this kind of research? So myself and two of my collaborators, Jessica Payer and Michael Zimmer, recently published a design fiction that is about a fictional study based on data off of a website that we made up that's kind of like Nextdoor. And the kinds of things that might happen based on this data, like consequences. This design fiction is actually written as a fictional IRB review because the point of all of this was, well, the IRB refused to review it because it didn't fall under their purview, but it shows all of these kinds of things that could go wrong. And this was inspired in part by a large number of examples of like public controversies of research where the response was, why did an ethics review board not do something about this? And the answer to it being, it wasn't human subjects research. So I guess I can skip this one. My fellow panelists just covered this particular example. Another one you might have heard of a couple of years, actually, I guess this was, yeah, a couple of years ago, some researchers at University of Minnesota basically did bad faith commits into the Linux kernel as a sort of, I mean, again, this security testing kind of thing. And people were so upset about it, the entire university got banned from the Linux kernel, and their IRB said that it was not human subjects research. Another fairly recent example of this, there was a study out of Princeton in which they emailed a very large number of websites. It was an automated kind of thing, pretending to, well, not it was a bit questionable about what they were pretending to be, but they were asking questions about like GDPR or CCPA compliance. So, the proprietor of a small website would get an email saying, we have these questions about your compliance to GDPR, please answer by this date. Because they wanted to, they were studying, how different websites are handling this kind of thing, except it really, really freaked people out. Like some people who ran small websites and did not have many resources, like called a lawyer, paid a lawyer to help them answer this email because they thought it was some kind of official thing and they were going to get into trouble. And the Princeton IRB had said that it was not human subjects research. Another example, again, from a few years ago, some researchers basically submitting fake papers to journals in order to try to make some points about peer review. And in this case, they had made the determination that it was not human subjects research. And then after there was this huge controversy and it got a lot of press attention, their IRB reprimanded them for not going through IRB for this particular study. A few other examples that did not get a ton of public attention, but that I heard about enough to tweet about them, which is why these are the only screenshots that I have. Some cases of published papers that used public social media data and were determined to be exempt by this first one was in the UK. An ethics review board in the UK saying because it was public data, it was fine. The second one was in the US, and again considered not human subjects research because of the use of public data. The first one, people who were in the community that was studied found out about the paper and got very, very upset, in part because some of the people who were quoted in the paper, it was about Twitter data, had since passed away. And so they thought this was very disrespectful. Some of the tweets had been deleted, et cetera. The second one was creating machine learning classifiers to categorize LGBTQ people on Twitter. And then another kind of study briefly mentioned in the last talk that tends to not fall under ethics review, at least in the United States, is when the data is not collected by the researchers. So what happened in the Facebook emotional contagion study is that the data was provided to researchers by Facebook, and because the researchers did not have any part in collecting that data, the data was not considered human subjects data. And this same kind of thing has happened in other cases. A study with Dropbox a few years ago, and most recently data about LinkedIn that was used in a large study. And this is a very recent example. Sensors were installed in labs at a university in the US, and the person who had installed these sensors without students' permission said that it wasn't human subjects research because the sensors were just studying desk usage, you like studying heat and not people. So the fact that like people were giving off the heat didn't matter because they were not like directly measuring humans. They were measuring heat created by humans, said that it was not human subject research. So this kind of thing, my final point here, the kind of thing that ethics review boards often do not cover is the like consequences of research. So for example, another kind of study that got a lot of attention was the Stanford gaydar study, which was training an algorithm to be able to determine from someone's photograph whether they were gay or straight. Also trained public data from dating sites. But a lot of the conversation was like, letting people know that this kind of research can be done. How should we be thinking about algorithms that could potentially be harmful? The paper that myself and my collaborators wrote recently, again, about the sort of fictional studies, these kinds of things, even if not directly in the data, can have real consequences, right? So if we are creating algorithms to infer criminality or to expose political orientation or trustworthiness from a photograph, even if it's just research, these things might be used in the real world. There was another paper about a fake IRB review published some time ago about Victor Frankenstein. And they made this point that like, what would have happened if Dr. Frankenstein had to go through an IRB in order to like, create the Frankenstein monster, happy Halloween, everyone. And one of the things they said was, he might have had to think about the potential risks and unintended consequences. But the truth is, no, he wouldn't have. At least in the United States, again, the federal law that covers what ethics review boards actually do explicitly says they do not consider possible long range effects. And so one of the big conversations happening in the sort of computer science world recently has been around broader impacts and unintended consequences. So for example, NeurIPS requiring broader impact statements in research papers. This is not the kind of thing that an ethics review body is thinking about. They might be concerned with some kinds of consequences. So for example, consequences to individuals like privacy violations, but not downstream harms, even to individuals. And they're not thinking about potential consequences for communities or for science or for society as a whole, or what might happen if bad actors use this research. And so it's really just like very narrow oftentimes when it comes to what ethics review is specifically doing. And that's not to say that what they're doing isn't important, because there are a lot of things that they are making sure don't happen that are really important. But we can't make ethics review bodies, especially in the US when they are so narrowly focused on human subjects research, be the arbiters of what's ethical. And so I tend to think about these three questions in terms of the kinds of things that people should be thinking about that tend to fall through these cracks. So what are the potential harms, including negative impacts more broadly? What can you be doing to mitigate those harms? And also, is there benefit to this research in the first place, and who does it benefit? And I will leave it with that. Thank you.